Hello and welcome to episode 2 of this broadcast on misconceptions about consciousness. Last week, we looked at the misconception that the body is different from the body. And this time we'll take a look at a second one, which we'll get to in just a minute. So as everybody's starting to come in, let's take a few moments to clear some space. So we'll take these few moments to empty out and make room for new perspectives. So take some full breaths in, filling the lungs, and breathe it out. Everyone taking a deep breath in and exhaling it all out. All the tension, all the confusion, all the doubt, all the questions. All right. So welcome everyone. Rox, Jesse. So last week we looked at the first misconception, which was consciousness is different from the body. So let me just answer a few questions first that came through over the last week. If you can't hear me, let me know, but hopefully everything's coming through. So one question was, what is the link between consciousness and the body, right? Why does my consciousness even want or need to have a body? So we're taking the three minds perspective here. So this question is addressing consciousness as a first mind phenomenon, right? Remember last week we saw that from a second mind perspective, what we call the body itself is an expression of this underlying consciousness, of a more undifferentiated nature of consciousness. And from the first mind perspective, a parcel of this or a package of this consciousness is what we are recognizing as our own individual consciousness. And this is what the question is. What is the link between this consciousness and the body, between the first mind consciousness? And why does this first mind experience, why is it even related to a body? So when we talk about our own individual consciousness, our own individual experience, each of us has different desires, right? Different things we want to do, different places we want to go, different ways in which we want to express. Let me just come back over here. So because of that, there are different tools, different instruments that we need to experience this, right? So for right now, to even express communication, to talk about this, for example, there are certain tools we need, right? One is the internet, one is the connection, one is the laptop, the camera. All of these are tools, the speakers, right? All of these are tools that we need to express in this way, in this moment. And so along with that is comes the eyes, the nose, right? Without eyes, we wouldn't be able to see this in the same way. Without ears, we wouldn't be able to hear this in the same way. And so what we experience as the body is almost like a toolkit that we can use to express and experience life in accordance with our desires and our tendencies, right? And that's why the body changes depending on the tendency, right? So if I were a football player and I was getting tackled and had to break tackles and all that, then the body would be much bigger because that's the tool needed to satisfy that desire, right? To run fast, for to complete these athletic feats. That's the kind of body that's necessary. So that body accordingly will be developed through the desire to want to express that way. So from the first mind perspective, we can say that we are kind of molding this body in accordance with the tendencies. From the second mind perspective, of course, we're not differentiating fundamentally between what we call the body and consciousness. The body is itself a representation of consciousness, just like we might see in a dream, in which the body that we have in the dream is simply a representation of mind, of the dreaming mind. And yet, from the dream character's perspective, that body is unique and, in a sense, adapted to experience that particular scene. So we can see the relationship between the body and consciousness from both of these perspectives. Okay, so the next question was, could the body be considered a vehicle to experience consciousness? And that's what we just talked about. So there, the response is yes. Is our body a vibration? So going to the second mind view, from the second mind view, just like we're looking in the dreaming view, that body is a representation, right, of that dreaming mind. Could we say in that dream that the body is a vibration? Yeah, we could, right? In fact, if you look at the dream example, the character's body in the dream, we really can't, on one hand, you can say almost anything about it, right? Is it a body? Yeah, we could say it's a body. Is it bones and muscles and organs? Yes. Is it a kind of information? Is it embodied information? Yes, we could say that. Because we realize that all of these are like metaphors or they're like poetry in describing what the body is. And the only right or wrong comes in when we give specific definitions for these words. So when I define vibration in a particular way with some prior assumptions, then we can say either yes or no, the body is a vibration or body is not. But when we're saying that the body and what we call matter and what we call the physicalized world is itself the representation of consciousness, then we can use whatever term makes sense. And so is it energy? Is it mind? All of these can be implied. And similarly, yes, we can say it's vibration. Just says everything is vibration. So that also works. Deborah says yes. All right. So the next question was, is consciousness our deeper potential or deeper identity? Yes, as the second mind, consciousness is this deeper potential, deeper reality, and most significantly, deeper identity, right? Why most significantly? Because if we're simply saying that the second mind that we're speaking of, this consciousness is simply a, let's say, an abstract phenomenon that the world is, right? It doesn't really have much relation to us, right? It's kind of like, okay, that sounds nice. Maybe consciousness is, maybe it isn't, but what does it really have to do with us? It seems very theoretical. But this key point about identity, that this identity of the individual, that very sense of being an individual, that very sense of identity is itself an offshoot, a sprout of this deeper identity. And therefore, by tracing the sense of identity, one arrives at this deeper sense of identity. And just like it's important to say that it's also related to our identity, the other side is also important, which means it's not just a person's identity or just the identity of, people or human beings or animals. It is identity at a fundamental level, that even what we call matter or what we consider to be dead or what we consider to be inanimate is itself a representation, a co-representation at the first mind level of this second mind, right? So it's not sufficient to say that consciousness is the deeper nature of reality, that the experience is that it's also our own deeper nature and also this deeper nature of the world. This is something for everyone to investigate, explore, consider, not to be taken as a fact just by hearing it. All right. Anik is asking the two books on the shelf. So this was the first book I wrote called Michelangelo's Medicine. It was during my, or actually after my training that I wrote it. Hopefully that'll stay up. And this was the second book called Is This a Dream? And both are available on Amazon. The second one, Is This a Dream, is more into reflection and inquiry. The first one is more about medicine, transforming healthcare. The subtitle is How Redefining the Human Body Will Transform Health and Healthcare. So the next question, how can one relay and express this to someone, those experiences that you can't put your hands on, right? Which is a very good question, and which is exactly why this three minds framework felt necessary, right? It was a way of building a bridge of communication between what I was experiencing and the sense of identity that was changing and the world. Because otherwise it can be hard to interface, right? Hard to have conversations. And so this framework is a kind of bridge. It's a kind of translation service that I use to try and communicate some of this. All right. So that brings us to the misconceptions. Let's look at the second misconception. And I'm talking about this misconception because this is actually somebody in my extended family actually mentioned this. And that was that exploring consciousness is a way to avoid what's happening. All right. So this is a second misconception about consciousness, which often happens when it comes to people around you, right? What other people see, what it looks like. Exploring consciousness is a way to avoid what's happening. So let's take a close look at this. Why is this misconception there? Right? The first thing is when the first mind is overwhelmed, right? When there's so much going on, or there's confusion about what's happening, or there's too much that's happening, one event after the other, or there's maybe a loss of a sense of meaning, whatever the reason is, when this first mind is overwhelmed and we hear this idea about consciousness or spirituality or meditation, any related topic, then it can be very natural for some to gravitate towards that and to say, what is that? What is this talking about? Right? Because naturally, in the experience of suffering, one looks for anything to alleviate that suffering. And so, in this initial stage of exploring or looking at something else, it can often seem like we're avoiding the things in our life. And whether we are or not is a matter of opinion. But what I'm trying to say is that there's this natural exploring phase, there's this natural inquisitive phase where a person might start to leave behind some of the activities that they had previously been into to start to inquire into this deeper nature, into what this is, right? And that can be done in a healthy way, or it can be done in an unhelpful way, in a way that makes things worse, right? If I'm avoiding too many of those responsibilities, then that can make things even more difficult because I'm neither here nor there. On the other hand, if we can investigate this bit by bit, whether it's meditation, whether it's listening to talks, whether it's journaling, introspection, walking in nature, there are myriad ways to start exploring this. But if we can explore this bit by bit and use that little bit of space to then take care of the responsibilities we need to take care of in the first mind world, then this kind of idea goes away, that we're not actually using this exploring consciousness as a way to avoid what's happening. But in fact, it becomes the very opposite, where what we're doing is actually opening up some of the layers of the mind that we were not accessing before, right? So meditation is not a process where a person goes into meditation and stays in some state and then comes out and that state goes away and goes back to the everyday world, right? That's in the beginning, it can start like that, but ultimately, what's happening is that awareness expands in meditation, right? And then that same awareness comes into the world and we act in the world in that way. So, from meditation being a practice, it goes to meditativeness. The nature of the mind is more meditative. And this is when that shift happens from consciousness and exploring consciousness being something that's avoiding what's happening in the world to actually including and encompassing and embracing what's happening in the world. Right? So this is very important. For people that are not exploring this, this is a common criticism because even people who are very well meaning, because there's a sense that, oh, we have to do this, right? I got a text message, I have to respond. I got 3 emails, I have to respond. Or, any number of things. There are some things we have to respond to, but many of the things that we are responding to are out of automation and not out of choice, not out of what really nourishes us, not out of what we really value. And so dropping those things away is actually a good thing, right? And sitting with the discomfort that comes up, sitting with the discomfort that propels that automation, that is also a good thing. So exploring consciousness, I would say, is a way to not avoid what's happening, but actually look at it head on. Because when one sits and closes the eyes, the reason people will say meditation is difficult is because all the things I did not want to see or hear or think or feel in decades past will come up. And in the beginning, it's not easy to sit there and be as these experiences come up and are processed and released. All right. So that's the first sense of the misconception that exploring consciousness is a way to avoid what's happening. So there's another sense, maybe another two senses actually. The second sense is that as this second mind perspective sets in, right, what can happen is the attention and the awareness is of such a different quality that a lot of the first mind tendencies can fall away, right? The first mind roles, the first mind actions, the first mind um, patterns of behavior, that can start to fall away. And this also can be perceived as, exploring consciousness as a way to avoid what's happening. And even though the misconception is the same, the reason is quite different, right? In the first example, it's because what's happening is actually overwhelming. And so there's a tendency to move towards something else to either avoid what's happening or to deal with what's happening even more fully by engaging it in a new way. That's the first mind sense. In a second mind sense, what can appear as avoiding is really the view has opened up and the sense of identity can be starkly different, or at least considerably different. And because that's so different, what we attend to, the way we use attention, and the way we use our roles and expressions can be very different. And this also can be misconceived, right? So these are two ways in which this misconception can happen. So the third way, which is really just a combination of the two, is what I call the transition state, the transitional state. And that's when we are in between this first and second mind phenomenon. I talk about this in the series on Is This a Dream? Let me just, for those asking, the videos, full set of videos can be found here. And there was a series many months ago, I think it was about 30 talks on the book back there actually, Is This a Dream? And we talk in detail about the transition state. And what is this transition state? This is when it's kind of like above water and below water, right? Getting a breath, can't breathe. This is this shift and movement between the first and second minds, right? Where the view isn't clear and steady, and yet it's not totally muddled. It's this kind of no man's land. And this too can be, this in fact can be some of the most challenging times because it seems like things are clear, it seems like something's there, and then it kind of goes away. So this time also can be misconceived as using consciousness to avoid what's happening. But just like with anything else, there is a certain period of transition, a certain period of acclimation, a certain period during which this different way of functioning has to set in. And so that has to be honored, and due time and space are required for that. So these are three different situations in which this misconception can crop up. Which misconception? The misconception that exploring consciousness is a way to avoid what's happening. Now, can it be a way? It can be, right? Just like anything can be. We can use any activity as a way to avoid something else, right? That's just opportunity cost. By virtue of doing one thing, I cannot do another thing, right? Just because attention is on that. But hopefully, by looking at these, we can see the ways in which it can appear this way, but in fact, that's not the full picture of what's happening. Shito says, I need to be consciously less critical of myself and others. Any tips to get to this point faster? I would say be aware of that sense of criticizing, right? That movement. So before I criticize myself, there's this movement, there's this push towards that. And becoming aware of that can develop the sense of where it's coming from, right? Where is that pressure from which this sense of self-criticism is coming? Or where's the pressure from which the sense of criticizing others is coming? And by attuning to that, that pressure can release. And then as that pressure releases, that tendency to criticize will also be released. So it's not really an analytical process. It's more gaining a felt sense for that criticism, right? It's almost like if you look at a flower and we want to say, where is this flower coming from? Why is this flower expressing in this way? We can trace it to the root, and we can look at the nutrients that are feeding this flower. And in seeing the nutrients in the root, we can see how the flower is expressing above ground. So similarly, as the thought of self-criticism comes, or the thought of criticizing others comes, becoming sensitive to where this is coming from, right? And it looks like that's already happening, and that's why this question is coming from. Now, that's not to say I don't take the view that therefore we should never criticize something, right? I think there's a place for criticism in a way, in the sense that we're looking at something closely, or if something needs to change, right? I'm not talking about disparaging oneself or disparaging someone else, but taking a closer look at something and saying, hey, this needs to change, or this isn't the best way forward. That's also part of this whole process. All right, so next week we'll continue with episode 3 of Misconceptions about Consciousness. If you have questions, just submit them here, or you can submit them on the website. And I'll see you next week.